Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you, as always, for joining. So we were looking at the. Good morning. Sorry. Morning. So we were looking at the impact on Torah SheBichtav, on the written Torah of culture and society at the time. And we looked last week at 2 weeks ago. We looked at some of the legal texts. Last week we looked at some of the story of the Mabul, I think, from comparisons. And this week I want to look at Ma'aser Bereshis itself, at the story of the creation of the world itself. Because again there, whilst obviously the story of Bereshis in and of itself is a core part of the Torah and is telling us about the creation of the world, B'riyas Ha'olam, nonetheless, it's possible that certain emphases in the story are put there in order to, on a pshat level, in order to contrast with prevalent creation myths which were around at the time. So again, we're not chas v'shalom here talking about a change to the core Torah, but it could be that on a pshat level, the Torah is adding in certain details or emphasizing certain details in order to compare and contrast with other beliefs at the time. And on a pshat level, this will help us understand some of the psukim. And again, I'm piggybacking here on the research of others. There are many creation stories. I'm not going to go into all of them, some of which reflect radically different worldviews to ours, and some of which, this is a topic for another day, have implications for perhaps how societies were run at the time. Because don't forget, even in our own Masorah, we say Malchusa, Terakia, the heavenly, or Malchus the heavenly court parallels the earthly court. And often religions create a hierarchy of gods and the like to parallel how the royal court functions at the time. So many of them have a view of the creation of humanity, in which humans are created as the slaves of the gods. One of the classic creation mythologies at the time describes how the lesser gods are serving the senior gods, and the lesser gods stage a strike because they're fed up with doing this. And the solution found to the problem is to create humans, because humans will be a good labor force for the gods. So there's religions that sort of create a whole different theology. But here I'm just going to engage in one creation myth, which in the pshat level, it would seem that perhaps the Torah engages in conversation with. In other words, the way the Torah emphasizes certain parts of the story may be in response to this myth. And this is again something we looked at when we looked at the Mabul story. This is the so-called Enuma Elish. This was again recovered in the 1850s from the library of Ashurbanipal, which we mentioned, which we mentioned before, which was at Nineveh. It's a very large ancient library from which, amazingly, we've discovered a large number of texts. The particular fragments found date from the 7th century before the Common Era, so considerably after Matan Torah. But as far as we can tell, probably go back. They're probably a copy of a compositional text that date back to Hammurabi, who we mentioned previously. It's about 1,800 years before the Common Era. In other words, predating the time of Matan Torah. Many other fragments have been found. It's been pieced together by lots of different bits. We've got about 1,000 lines written in Old Babylonian, recorded on 7 clay tablets. And this is one of the most important sources for understanding ancient Babylonian theology, their sort of worldview. Describes the creation of the world, a battle between the gods, and so on. It's not clear exactly why this tablet was put together, what its purpose was. Maybe it was read out at festival times and sort of a way of publicly declaring the belief. But be that as it may, there seems to be a description of their creation. Now, the basic theology is obviously completely counter to Yiddishkeit. It describes the world as being produced through the mating of 2 gods. Interestingly, these 2 gods are, one is the god of water, fresh water, which is life-sustaining, and the other is the god called Tiamat, which probably is somewhat akin to Tehom. It describes this sort of chaotic, primordial creation. It may be used to refer to salt water. So if you're engaged in farming in Babylonia, the enemy is salt water making ingress into saltwater marshes, and the force of good is the fresh water from the rivers that can be and springs that can be used to farm. And you see this struggle between order and chaos. And the way you'll speak about life emerging from the struggle between order and chaos will be this battle between Mayim and Tahom. So this split obviously reflects a hashkafa, a theology that's completely contrary to ours, a dualism in nature. We know that in Babylonian theology there's a very strong stream of dualism, force of good and the forces of evil. But it's interesting that these two forces are reflected by Mayim and Tahom. So when we look at the Brias HaOlam, the creation of the world, again, maybe this on a pshat level helps us understand why the Torah sort of speaks about this Mayim and Tahom and this sort of contrast between the two. But it tells us, unlike this theology, all of this comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that's the message of the Torah, obviously, is this comes from Hashem. This doesn't come from this battle. Interestingly, also, it then carries on, by the way, the story. It speaks about the water being split between water above the Rakia and water below the Rakia. It speaks about the creation of the Ma'oros, the great heavenly lights and bodies, which fix the calendar. And then it speaks about the creation of man. Now, again, in terms of a challenge to Emunah, as this is sometimes presented, a challenge to belief by the biblical critics and so on, there's no challenge to Emunah. It's a story that has certain similarities. Because ancient people needed to understand the same, everyone's obsessed by the same basic questions about life. Where do we come from and what we're here for and how we meant to make sense of this crazy world which seems to have so much good in it and yet seems to have so much chaos and badness in it. These are the basic questions that every thinking person in their own way engages in. Again, it may be reflecting certain traditions that they had from, we mentioned before. I mean, there are traditions floating around at the time. Many of them, don't forget, these people are not that far removed from Noach, from Shem and Ever, from Adam. These are people that are mixing in the ancient world, dealing with similar sorts of truth. And it may be, as the Rambam tells us, we're used to thinking of the world as starting off with paganism and then arriving at monotheism. The Rambam tells us the opposite. The world starts off at monotheism. It drifted towards paganism as legends and myths kept in, as people look towards belief in more relatable powers and this very abstract gods who we can't really connect to. So legends creep in and so on. So there's not particular challenges from this, but it's interesting the comparisons. It's interesting that Mayim and Tahom are these two fundamental forces, and it's interesting that there's a sort of a parallelism in how they're set up. In fact, one of the big characters in this mythology is a big beast called a Tunin, a dragon or some sort of serpent or massive reptile of sorts. Which is in the sort of anti-god in this mythology. It's this force of evil that's fighting the gods and trying to destroy everything. There's a whole story there in which I'm not going to go into the whole mythology. There's a whole explanation there of where this dragon emerges from, and this is the one that's the being that's sort of trying to counter the creation of the world and creation of human beings. And by the way, as I mentioned already, there's a fundamental underlying message which is very much at contrast with the message of the Torah. So in this text, the message is not that man is at the pinnacle of creation, as the Torah tells us, but rather man is this undignified being. For us, it's very important that man has Tzelem Elokim, that humanity was created by an altruistic God in order to give us purpose and meaning and direction and so on. There's a fundamental optimism about creation in my SheBichtav. Every few lines, HaKadosh Baruch Hu sees us as good. We in our hashkafa, we fundamentally live in a good world in which the challenges are there as challenges in order for us to emerge as expressing our potential for Tzelem Elokim, our potential for godliness. Everything comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is both the source of light and the source of darkness. In these creation mythologies, man has the opposite of dignity. He's created as a slave for the gods and has to fight for ability to exist and to flourish. We saw in the Mabul story how the gods want to control population. They don't like the noise of humans. They don't want overpopulation, as opposed to our Mabul story, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says Puravu after the Mabul. He wants us to flourish. This isn't in Torah SheBichtav, but in the Medrash, we're told a very different story about man's discovery of fire. So fire is the most basic technology that human beings have. And rather than, as in the Greek legends, man stealing fire from the gods, and the gods not wanting us to achieve sophistication, in our medrash we're told that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us fire on Motzi Shabbos in order to help us master and conquer the world. So it's completely different mindsets. I don't mean, by the way, Chas v'sholom, I keep saying ours and theirs. I don't mean in any way to make a comparison. I'm just saying, just if we're engaging in this, understanding what the Torah is emphasizing and helping us understand this is important. And this really, this is not my point. This is Kasuta who points this out. He says this perhaps helps us understand one of the most enigmatic sections of Brias Olam. And he points out many of these comparisons, but one of them he points out is the pasuk that tells us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the Tanin. Now, this isn't a minor or insignificant detail in the story of Ma'aser Bereishis. It's mentioned as one of the, in fact, one of the only unique objects as well, unique beings created by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we understand why the sun and the moon being described as being created by Hashem is important. But the Tanin is simply a form of life. Why is it emphasized in the Psukim? More than that, the Tanin is one of only 3 times where the word Bria is used in the story of creation. So Bria is used in the creation of the universe, Bereishis bara Elokim. Bria is used in the creation of the Tanin, this dragon or serpent of sorts, and Bria is used in the creation of human beings. So in a different context, I explain this based on Rashi. Bria means yesh me'ayin, something from nothing, as opposed to Yetzira, which is what a craftsman does, which is when you're forming yesh me'yesh, something from something else. It's interesting that in the creation of the world, Bria is only used 3 times. Once used in the creation yesh me'ayin of the universe coming into existence. The second time, how Rashi understands Tanin, which is a whole class or category of creatures, and it means the bringing of life into existence. And the third time is the bringing of humanity into existence. So if we look at the creation of the world, whilst animals may have developed from each other and so on and so forth, if one chooses to understand things in this way, the creation of the universe, however, is an act of Bria. This isn't yesh me'yesh, it's yesh me'ayin. The creation of life, the first life itself, is yesh me'ayin, and the creation of human beings without Tzelem and Elokim, with our neshamas, with our intelligence and our ability to reason and moral judgments and so on, this is also a yesh me'ayin. So Rashi says that with the Tanin, this is the creation of a whole category of beings. The second explanation Rashi gives to explain why Tanin is singled out is, he says we're dealing here with a specific animal, and then he goes into Midrashim, which are very difficult to understand, about the role of the Levioson, and how eventually the Levioson will be slaughtered and served to the Tzaddikim in Ma'aser Bereishis. Rashi, by the way, when he says this, is coming from a whole series of Psukim. There's many Psukim. We don't learn enough Yeshaya, so we don't know these Psukim. There's many Psukim in Yeshaya who speak about on that day when the Yom Hadin, when Mashiach comes, when there's redemption, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will punish the Levioson, the flying serpent, the crooked serpent. He'll wound the Tanin. Then we speak about the creation of the world. It says you divided the sea. Tehillim says you broke the heads of the sea monsters, you crushed the head of Levioson, etc. So there's many psukim that talk about the Tanin as being something that will eventually be destroyed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Tanin appears right at the end of time, and here the Tanin appears right at the beginning of time in the creation of the world. So as Rashi brings these midrashim that we don't really understand what they're saying, what is this big Tanin and why is it important? And it's the big Levioson. It's important that they should be shachted. The Rambam speaks about this. The Rambam says the Tanin, the word Bria is used because the Tanin is so massive. And so on and so forth. The Sifano says what I said before, that the world's Bria is used because this isn't just the potential for life being brought out. This is something new that's happened. All of these are very difficult to understand. Kasuta similarly points out that we understand better the Pasuk and we understand better these Midrashim once we understand that the Tanin is a big character in Bovel at the time. Right, in Bovel at the time, in the Middle East at the time, there's this Tanin, which is this big anti-God force, which in the mythology is there battling with the gods and so on. And here the Torah is telling us, no, that Chas v'sholom, we don't live in a world in which there's any force which is ultimately anti-HaKadosh Baruch Hu. These are all created by Hashem. Just like in another parallel, Yotza'or, HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates light, and he creates out of nothing darkness. So darkness is the why does it say Yotza'or v'Vori Choshech? Yesh mi'yesh for light. Light is created something from something. It's Yotza, it's the craftsman. And Bori Choshech, Choshech is created from dark, from nothing. And what does it mean to create darkness? Do you create darkness? I mean, darkness is a nothingness, it's an absence. And the answer is that when you create darkness, that means that's the more fundamental thing. you don't have darkness till there's the potential or the reality of light. It's not dark if in a universe in which there's no photons, in which there's no light. There's nothing. There's no dark or no light. When you create the possibility of light, that's yesh miyesh. That's yesh miyan. That's something from nothing. You've got the possibility of darkness, of non-light. Now, yotzer, that vacuum, that absence of light, can now be filled with light. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates the potential for darkness, the absence of light, and now we engage in partnership with HaKadosh Baruch Hu with filling this world with light. So this word bria is used with borei choshech, and it's used here with the bria, with the creation of the tanin, with the creation of this sort of a beast, which somehow represents the counter forces in the non-Jewish theology at the time, and it's telling us that this comes from, ultimately, all comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So again,
In the first paragraph, Koshak, of course, is mentioned before O.
Yes.
So was created first.
Choshech has to be created before Or, because Choshech is the absence of light. The absence of light has to be created before light itself. You don't have absence of light till there's the potential of light. In chronology, it maybe they happen at the same time, but in concept, you have a world in which there's no absence of light. Our world, our universe is absence all sorts of things. We can't even call them things because they're no things. They don't exist. You can imagine other things existing, in which case there'd be an absence of them. But there isn't an absence of them because they don't exist. With the creation of light, two things are happening. As you create light, you create darkness, because it's only with the creation of light that there's the absence of darkness. But the true yesh me'ayin is the conceptual framework that lies behind light, in which there's the possibility of light. Now there's darkness, and then that can be populated with light. Before there's the concept of light, there's no darkness. It's not a relevant concept. There's no concept of the absence. This is how the Vilna Gaon explains this pasuk of Yotzer Choshech. So I'm just using it as a model for how we see bria being used. We see bria therefore being used in the tanin also. The tanin, we don't know exactly what the tanin is, right? We don't know what to make of it. We don't know when the Nevi'im talk about it being shachted, if they mean this literally or they mean this as a metaphor. But the point is that the Rambam in Mona V'chim told us that there's parts of Torah that we miss unless we understand the context in which they're written. And the Rambam says, were I able to know more about the history of the time, I would understand these parts of Torah better. On a pshat level, I'm simply arguing that these relatively recent, last 100, 150 years discoveries helps us understand what the Pesukim are saying more fully, more easily. And in terms of the topic of our shir, which was the social setting, cultural setting, historical setting at the time of the giving of the Torah relevant to the form and the language which the Torah uses? The answer is, again, yet another source that seems to tell us absolutely so. And there's insight, amazing insights and understanding into Torah that only emerge from understanding the concept of the time, at least on one level of reading. There may be multiple levels of reading, but on one level of reading, this gives us an insight into Torah, yeah.
So there's some indication, particularly use of the word, borrowing language, words
yes.
from a particular language, maybe the Zobin language.
Yes.
The only one. Although most people sort of imply very much related as the time, but it's an actual word borrowed from culture.
Okay, so the semantic or the vocabulary used isn't necessarily borrowed, because you have a whole family of Semitic languages which are being used there. Again, we now know how Lashon HaKodesh relates to proto-Semitic languages that are around, like Ugaritic and Akkadian and other languages which are around. There is some odd borrowing of words. We know that some words are borrowed into Lashon HaKodesh that aren't at root Semitic. For example, words which have more than a three-letter root are generally assumed not to be Semitic words in origin. There's certain texts where it's very clear words are borrowed, like in the Megillah, we have Megillah Sesta, we have a whole multitude of Achapashta, and so these words are certainly borrowed. But here it's not necessarily that the words is borrowed, but the use of the words and the concept of the words is borrowed. So Tanin is, as far as I know, I'm not an expert, as far as I know, it's a Semitic word. It's a word that's as native to Lashon HaKodesh as is to any of these other languages. But its use over here, that the concept of it featuring in Ma'aser Bereishis maybe as a response to a sort of a way of viewing the world at the time. I'm not even saying it's a direct response to it. Language is used and mythology and theology develops because it's speaking to something in the time. Why a tunnin is the appropriate symbolism, why people at the time see a tunnin as a representative of evil is very hard to answer, right? What that symbol says to people. But in people living at the time, that's how they see evil. We may, in modern language, represent evil with modern terminology, right? In 1,000 years' time, people may struggle to understand why, I don't know, why a trivial word like camps might have connotations to us that are both positive. We might think of children's holiday camps, and the negative. So there's words that have assume a sort of symbolism and significance because of things going on. The people at the time are Jew and non-Jew are grappling with the same sort of basic problems. How do we resolve a world which has Mayim and also has Tahayim? The Torah is coming to teach us something, and it's using the language of the time or the cultural mindset of the time to teach us these ideas. Again, as I've mentioned again and again, the Ikar Chamishi of the Rambam tells us, the fifth principle of faith, that the Torah is eternal. The message of the Torah is as relevant now as it was then. But the language and the vocabulary used and the style in which it's put, the Rambam Monavuchim says, at least on a Peshat level, can be understood and should be understood in the context of the time. There may be deeper levels in which we understand different ideas that are being expressed, but this is a reading of the Pesukim in which it's using the vocabulary. When I say it's using the vocabulary of the time, I don't mean the actual words is borrowed from another culture. I mean the vocabulary, the concept, the terminology, the way of thought is responding to perhaps norms that are prevalent in other cultures, perhaps norms that are prevalent in Klal Yisrael also. Avraham emerges from this world. Klal Yisrael affected by Mitzrayim and the theology of Egypt. And so it's speaking to the people that are emerging from that mindset and that culture.
Yeah. The question of the Yetzias Mitzrayim when Pharaoh says V'yu l'sanin.
Yes.
And there's a machlokes between them and
yes.
what the sanin is.
Yes.
Is a sanin, which is this great big thing? It would seem not. It seems to be like a crocodile or something like that. But nevertheless, the Torah is using the same word, like from Berea, and yet it's now not that far away when it comes to Yetzias Mitzrayim.
Correct. So it may be that the borrowed words is used for both the tunnin, the great crocodile, which are massive creatures, and for this enormous creature, which is either mythological or exists in some other plane, like the Leviathan and the like. I mean, this is a good example of things, actually. I mean, you can go and see in the British Museum. The British Museum, unfortunately, only has about a fifth of its exhibits out at any one time. They always have about 4/5 in storage because they don't have space. But I was lucky enough to be there once when they had a crocodile, an embalmed crocodile on display, sat in a that was again looted by the British and brought over to the British Museum. For some reason, this isn't being lobbied to be taken back to Egypt. And they speak there about the fascination the Egyptians had with this. They had this sort of worship of it. They ascribed divinity to the crocodile, and they also had this fear of it. And they used to feed it. They used to maintain them in big temples. They used to have these enormous crocodiles, massively fed in great temples. So it's like all our votes are. Do they think this actual crocodile that dies is a god? They see it as some sort of physical manifestation of a metaphorical god, of a great tunnin, of a force of nature. Just like when they're worshipping idols, they see this physical idol, which can be smashed by an Avraham Avinu, as representing a force of nature and so on. So they have this crocodile there in front of them. It represents for them the force and the wildness of this force of nature of this society. So this tunnin in front of us is a representative of a larger tunnin of that force of nature. They put it through an MRI scanner, and you can see the last meal that this lucky or unlucky crocodile had before it died. It also helps us understand Ibn Ezra, right? Ibn Ezra understands that the Sephardeia are crocodiles, and therefore we have this beautiful sequence, the Makkahs, in which one by one the Makkahs are attacking Egyptian forces, things that the Egyptians worship. They worship the Nile. Nile, by the way, again, is fresh water, right? Every society needs its fresh water, and that becomes dumb, and then they worship the crocodiles, and the crocodiles turn on them, and you get this great horde or plague of crocodiles attacking them. There's midrashim that speak about when the back of the tzfadeh is hit, out pop more. Again, in this crocodile in the British Museum, you can see embalmed crocodile, and embalmed on the back of the crocodile are baby crocodiles. They used to embalm the babies of the crocodiles on the back. These babies used to perch on the mud on the back of the crocodiles. And again, you can see the baby crocodiles perching on its, embalmed on its back. So again, there's a lot we don't know about the Torah. I'm not here taking sides between how the Ibn Ezra understands it and Rashi understands it and other Rishonim understand it. I'm just saying that it's a bracha that we live in a time when we can go to the museum, half an hour on the underground, and we can see a crocodile and see what the Egyptians thought about this. Again, Chazal had a Masorah that Paro, the Pesukim say, Li Arav Ani Yosef, that Paro saw himself as a divinity, as a god. This wasn't in all ancient cultures. In many ancient cultures, they saw the hierarchy of the palace system as paralleling the godly system, in which there's a similar hierarchy of lesser gods and senior gods and so on. In Paro, they didn't see like that. They saw Paro as, in Egypt, they didn't see like that. They saw Paro as the god himself. So I don't know. It's difficult to know, but it could be this Tanin is simply borrowed language. You have a lesser monster and a greater monster, or it could be there's an exact parallel between the use of the two. Okay, so this is another area parallel. I want to try now talk about two more examples of this phenomena. One is an idea that was made very famous by Rabbi Sachs. I think really though first brought to light properly by Professor Joshua Berman, who still writes books around these subjects. And this is a suggestion as to how to understand the concept of bris, covenant in the Torah, and how this can help us understand many parts of the Torah, and in particular Sefer Devarim. So I've spoken about this before in my Parsha share actually on Wednesday night fairly recently. But in brief, the concept of covenant isn't one that we speak enough about. The Torah is full of bris, full of covenants between humans and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from Noach after the Mabul to Avraham Avinu to Klal Yisrael at Matan Torah. It's a bris. Then there's a later covenant between the Jewish people and Hashem in the Avos Moav, and yet another covenant. The Tzorach is referred to as a covenant, and then of course we have bris milah, bris bein Abasorim, central parts of our history and so on, which are covenants between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we don't understand exactly what a covenant is. A covenant is some form of working together. So the amazing chiddush of Torah, of Yiddishkeit, is that we work together with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that somehow we're able to partner with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in some form partnership, not partnership of equals, but nonetheless a partnership in which we have a genuine role to play. A covenant isn't slavery. A covenant isn't where I'm the master and you're my slave. That's not a covenant. There's nothing mutual about it. A covenant doesn't mean equality either. It can be a recognition that one party is greater, one is lesser, but there has to be some dignity accorded to the lesser partner. They also have a role to play. A covenant also isn't a contract or a partnership. It's not that, or at least not a partnership in the business sense of the word. It's not that I will do X and you will do Y and we'll exchange goods or exchange services. It's a recognition that we're genuinely working together for the betterment of us both. A covenant has to be entered into freely, though freely is an interesting word. I have to choose to enter into a covenant, even though it may not be a complete choice. There may be a recognition that I can't handle it by going it alone. But nonetheless, there has to be a choosing to enter into a covenant. So this is an amazing chiddush that we can be in a covenant with Hashem. Right? He is infinite, he's almighty, but nonetheless he wants to have a covenant with us human beings, and this again gets back to the idea of Bechira and Selam and HaKadosh Baruch has given us the ability to master this world. We're given this world to make of it what we want, for better or for worse, and therefore the concept of covenant is there. Now, there's many ways of using this idea of covenant to help us understand the Torah. The Torah, by the way, itself is referred to as Sefer Bris. The whole Torah is referred to as Sefer Bris. But one insight which we can use is in understanding Sefer Devarim. Sefer Devarim is a very difficult book to understand. Which mitzvahs are included, which mitzvahs aren't included. It's called Mishnah Torah, a repetition of the Torah, but it's not a repetition of the whole Torah. There's many mitzvahs which aren't repeated. There's other mitzvahs which come for the first time in Sefer Devarim. What's the idea of Mishnah Torah? Why would you have a repetition of the Torah at all? What's the concept of a repetition? Why? I mean, once it's been said once, why bother repeating it? It's also a very, very strange idea. I understand maybe Moshe needed to repeat it to the Jewish people, so he said it. So Torah could have written the whole of Sefer Devarim in one line. Moshe repeated the whole Torah. For us as learners of the Torah, why would it be repeated? Why? I mean, we can look back at the original 4 books. Why do we need to look at the repetition of the Torah at all? Why is it included in the Torah at all? And then the whole structure of Sefer Devarim is very, very difficult. We were shown him struggle with this. The order of the mitzvahs, the sequence. There's a lot of very deep mysteries around Sefer Devarim. So I'm not enough of an expert to know if he was the first, but I think the first person to systematically engage with using ideas suggested by others, but to understand Sefer Devarim is Professor Joshua Berman, and publicized and popularized by the late Rabbi Sachs. He says that we need, in order to understand Sefer Devarim and really the whole Torah and understand the concept of a bris, we need to look at treaties that were made in the ancient world, and there's a remarkable parallel between them. We're used to thinking of a world in which you either have alliances between equals, or you have an empire which conquers vassals. But in the ancient world, and in its own way in the modern world also, there's another form of treaty that can be made, which is a treaty between a more dominant empire or kingdom and a weaker but nonetheless semi-autonomous state. Don't forget, in a world in which communication isn't so easy, you can't necessarily rule over far-flung kingdoms far from your own people. You may nonetheless want to work in partnership with them. And therefore, there's a sophisticated system, and we have thousands of copies of these. And in a moment, I'll talk about why we have copies of these. A sophisticated system of treaties that were made. It's called in English suzerainty, a sort of a senior king and a junior king under them, in which treaties were made, which all took a certain structure and a certain form, in which the greater king says to the lesser king, you recognize my authority, you will continue to rule your people, you will continue to tax them, you'll give me some level of tribute, but often notional. But the main thing is we'll be allies. I will come to help you when you're in trouble, you will come to help me when I'm in trouble. I will ensure that if you die, your children become your successors. I'll recognize the right of your royal house to continue, and various other conditions associated with this agreement. And this is a very effective way for both parties. If you're the dominant state in the region, nonetheless, you're aware that other dominant states a bit further away. It's quite convenient to have a buffer zone and to have allies around. You don't have the ability to master them, to rule over them, to make them an empire. You don't have an army for it. You don't have a communications for it. You don't have transport for it. It's inefficient to have to dominate them. They'll just become your enemies. They'll just bring enemies closer to your borders. On the other hand, you want them to be allies. You don't want them just to let your enemies to go forward, or even worse, to cooperate with your enemies. And therefore, you make this sort of working together partnership. It's not a partnership of equals. It's recognized that one is dominant and the other is inferior. Nonetheless, it's a win-win for both. The smaller party avoids having the larger kingdom fighting it and being its enemy, and the larger kingdom avoids having to fight these cluster of small allies, and it has this whole gathering of allies around. And again, I'm not going to go through the whole history, but we have a whole range of such treaties that have been discovered, whether etched out on stone, which again we know the Torah is etched out on stone, or an scroll form, as we know the Torah is written on scroll form. And this is a very common type of covenants around. By the way, we see in Tanakh characters making a covenant referred to as a bris. Between humans, it's not just a relationship to Hashem. So, for example, Avraham makes a bris with Avimelech, the king of Palestine, as does Yitzchak. Yaakov makes a bris with Lavan, and so on. We see these sorts of treaties taking place. Now, if we look in the structure of these treaties, they all have a certain form, which helps us understand the perhaps what's going on in much of the Torah. And the form always starts off with a preamble, with an introduction, in which the time and place of the covenant is described. So the equivalent in the Torah would be, this is Moshe speaking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Ol Moed, this is Moshe addressing Klal Yisrael in the Avos Moav, or whatever the set may be. And then there's a historical introduction. There's always like a summary of the history between the two nations, in which the nations will will outline their relationship, what's happened, everything that's gone before. So the dominant party may say, I saved you from the oppressor, I rescued you, I've been good to you, I've been good to your ancestors. Every time a new king, by the way, comes on the throne, the covenant is repeated. So he'll give a summary of the history. Equivalent to there'll be a preamble, or in the beginning of Sefer Devarim, where Moshe gives them this very fast whirlwind tour of history so far at the beginning of Sefer Devarim. By the way, the preamble may change between time and time. You may emphasize different aspects of the story. The story is one story, it's history. But what aspects of the story do you bring out might change depending on what's going on. So if there's a new rising power on the block, you may emphasize how I saved you from this power also maybe a century ago when they were again threatening you. If the power relationship is shifting, if, for example, the dominant kingdom is becoming more dominant and the weaker kingdom has become weaker, it may emphasize more the dominance because it doesn't have to be quite as respectful. So the nature of the preamble can shift. They all on truth, just shared agreements of history, but with shifting emphasis on different aspects of it. Then there's the stipulations, the core agreements, equivalent to the Aseres HaDibros or the mitzvahs and Aseres Devarim. Then there are rules about where this covenant should be deposited, where should it be kept. That's part of this treaty. It specifies where it's meant to be kept. In other words, if you value this document and I value this document, we're going to agree to keep it somewhere. Very often where? In the palace of the king or in the temple. And then finally, you have sanctions. What's going to happen if you don't keep this covenant? What will be the consequences? And witnesses. Now, this exactly parallels the structure of Sefer Devarim. And again, for those who are interested, I'm not going to go through this in detail now. You can look at this online in some of Rabbi Sachs's writings, or you can buy Rabbi Berman's book, Professor Joshua Berman, where you'll see this in more detail. And there's an exact parallel here, for example, in the structure of Sefer Devarim, which begins with the prologue, then it has the historical introduction, then it has the stipulations, then it has the rules about where this should be kept and how it should be read. Again, Be'er Heitev, it should be written on the stone, and Hagrizim and Ha'eval, and it should be read out every so often. Then it has the brachas and klolos, the sanctions, what will be the consequences, the tochacha and the brachas, if you don't keep it. And then, of course, there's Hazvin Hashemayim, V'Adabera, etc. It has the calling of witnesses, who are the witnesses to this treaty. So this again gives us a bit of a giloi into a new understanding of Torah. This is a tremendous bracha because on a Peshat level it gives us a whole different way of reading what Sefer Devarim is about and what's really going on. Yeah, sorry.
I wanted to say that the word bris comes from the word bria.
Yeah.
And actually, when it's a bris, it's actually a new creation of what the two entities.
So there was another.
One is taken from the other, and it becomes literally a new creation.
There was another Ramosha who said that before Ramosha Menachman. The Rambam says that it's Brias. He brings us as Brias. Again, I spoke at Bris at length in my Wednesday night show where I discussed this Ramban. The Ibn Ezra is a different etymology from Beru, from choosing. The etymology of the word is a big topic. But you're absolutely right. It's the creation of something new. It's a contract is not the creation of something new. It's I am I and you are you, and we're just trading. A bris is creating something a new thing. But and certainly we understand this better from hearing about the treaties and the covenants in the ancient world. By the way, there's a number of incredible comparisons in the stipulations. The language of the treaties often includes a clause or a condition that there should be a re'iyas ponim, a visitation of re'iyas ponim, literally that word, between the vassal or the junior partner and the senior partner, in which she says, come to my palace a few times a year and I'll give you great coverage when you come there. Why would I give you great coverage? Because I recognize you're not a vassal, you're not my slave, you're an independent king, but you're my inferior, you're coming to me, but when you come there, I will give you great coverage. One of the mysteries of Parshas Mishpatim, which is again Sefer Bris, it's described at the end of Mishpatim. It talks about this as being the bris. It's following straight on from Matan Torah. One of the mysteries there, starting in the middle of it, it talks about Shalosh Regalim. Why is Shalosh Regalim there in the middle of Mishpatim? Mishpatim is about laws, and suddenly Shalosh Regalim appears there. And again, Re'iyas Ponim is one of the central features of this of these covenants, that there should be this regular, the same language used by the Torah in Shalosh Regalim and coming and visiting. There's rules about rereading this text, that it should be read every so often in public, again paralleling the mitzvahs and Sefer Devarim of the rereading of the text. So what we have here, I think again is a tremendous bracha of understanding things that maybe without this we wouldn't be able to understand. And the Rambam writes in his Moeduchim, Halavai, I've known more about ancient history, that I could have understood the Torah better. Again, though, what's unique here is this is, of course, a unique form of government. This isn't a treaty. I mean, this isn't a treaty between the Hittite emperor and a vassal. This is a treaty between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and human beings. What an amazing sort of dignity that HaKadosh Baruch Hu enters into a treaty or a covenant, not a treaty of equals again. It's a treaty in which there's, on the one hand, Kofanim HaKagigis, there's a recognition we're not equals. And on the other hand, there has to be a choice. There has to be a nas v'nishma, there has to be a willingness to accept into it. Who is the party to the other treaty? So of all the treaties and covenants that have been found, they're always between king and king. Who is the bris between Hashem and who's the other party in the treaty? Not just even the people, all of us as individuals. Every individual enters. Every individual enters into this bris and covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So again, it's taking a structure which is familiar to people at the time, and is reworking and using it as a way of communicating. How else, which we'll come on to next week, how else can the Torah communicate, at least on the pshat level, divine truths to real live human beings? It has to use a language that's understood, and it takes the language and the vocabulary of political agreement. And by the way, we do the same in our Talmud Torah to this day, right? If you want to explain to someone Chalak in the Torah or Bris or something like that, you may say it's like American hegemony, or like a treaty, or like even when I'm using this talk here, I'm saying it's not a contract, right? It's not this, it's not that. We're using the language of modern vocabulary to help us understand the concepts that are underlying the Torah. So the Torah uses this idea of, that's why, by the way, who has to come to the Riyas Polim? Who has to come and visit the counterparty? So in the classic treaty, it's the king, the lesser king comes to visit the senior king. In Halacha, it's the whole of Klal Yisrael come to visit the senior king, come to visit HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because the treaty is between the whole of the people and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this helps us, by the way, understand what Mishnah Torah is. Mishnah Torah is a book that's a copy of the covenant between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the people. The covenant's made at Har Sinai, and then it's repeated again with the next generation, exactly what takes place in the covenants that took place in the world at the time, in which in another generation there'd be another copy produced, and sometimes the copy would have subtle differences. Different aspects of them would be emphasized, exactly as takes place in Sefer Devarim, in which there are differences between the story that's told in Sefer Devarim and the story that's told in Reish Shmos Vayikra Midbar. Not contradictions, but emphasizing different parts of the story and different details of it. And again, things that we've discussed over the years in many shiurim and discussed by the classic Mefarshim. This is a re-entry into the covenant between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the people. Again, uniquely, when the Hittites or when the Egyptians, when the Hittite or the Egyptians enter into a covenant, this is not a covenant like the British Empire. It's not a treaty like the British Empire. It's not conquest. It's a treaty between two parties that respect and recognize each other's autonomy. They're not claiming there's an equality in power, but they recognize that by working together, something can come out that can't come out alone from this treaty. I'll just conclude. Any thoughts, questions, Ben? Sorry, I'm not speaking.
I was just going to say a modern example, I suppose, not perfect one, that is NATO and over time the Soviet bloc, again, where there's a dominant power.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. That's more like a covenant than a conquest. Yeah. It's not a conquest. It's a recognition that the dominant power isn't strong enough, or it's not in its interest, and why should it bother ruling over the other one? But there is a hidden threat behind it, which is I'll if the Warsaw Pact countries opt out, we'll come and send in the tanks. Yeah, it's somewhat analogous to this. I'll just finish off then the last minutes today, and then next week we'll look at one more genre of things that we can explain in Torah based upon these insights, and then I think we've done enough of this, and we'll move on to another topic. There is a I think I'm going to stop here because there's a whole other section that we need to speak on, and next week we'll start off on that. So I hope this gives some insight into one other area. I would urge you, by the way, to read Rabbi Sachs on this, to read Joshua Berman on this. I've really not done justice to what's an amazing Giloi in Torah that we've been zocher to in the last 100 years that we simply wasn't available in the past on a pshat level because we didn't understand these things. And again, I emphasize, like I have in previous year, I'm not claiming this is the only meaning behind the psukim, or of course not. We know that Chazal dosed the psukim extensively. Simply saying that in pshat, this helps us understand the form of the Torah. And what's been amazing in the research of the last 200 years or 200 plus years is that this has gone from being used as a challenge to Torah to extraordinary scholars like Rabbi Sachs and like Berman, who are showing us how this actually is machazek and helps us understand better what's going on in Torah and in mitzvahs. So I'll stop here for today. And next week we'll finish off the series, look at one more example of this, and then I'm open, by the way, to nominations. I've had a couple of suggestions, but to both those online, or everyone who is here live gets a double vote for nominations of topics. But I'm open to suggestions of what we should look at next, because we've done quite a lot on this. So next week I'll finish off this topic, and then the week after that we'll start something new. Thank you all so much for joining, as always.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.